What does that mean for people who don't know what a human rights framework is?
A human rights framework is essentially the legal underpinnings of human rights. Human rights is not just a matter of opinion. Human rights is not just a matter of saying what would be nice, or it's not even just a matter of philosophy, where you say, well, look at this philosophy, I support it or I don't support it.
To talk about some of the risks of being a campaigner, you know, this can be a dangerous job if you're fighting against very powerful people and organisations. What do you say to folk who may be afraid of getting involved?
You're right to say that working in social justice campaigning or human rights campaigning is not an easy or always safe pursuit. So the first piece of advice I would say is there's no shame in being afraid, and there's no shame at all.
Sacha serves as the Chief Executive of Amnesty International UK. He spent 6 years as Chair of the Board of War Child UK and was previously the Deputy Chair of Citizens Advice England and Wales. He was Chief Executive of Smart Energy Great Britain from 2013 to 2020. He's also a Non-Executive Director of the Fundraising Regulator.
You have led organisations both on the business end of running an organisation as well as the people end. I mean, what does it take? What are the skills that are necessary to be a leader of an organisation for people who want to follow in Sacha's footsteps and be a CEO in the future?
If you don't believe that people perform at their best when they're happiest, rather than perform at their best in a culture of fear, if you don't believe that actually your role is about helping people to be brave rather than making them afraid of being blamed, those are the qualities of someone who likes people.
Sacha, thank you so much for joining us on the School of Social Justice video podcast. We're really excited to have you on, particularly given all of the experience you've had leading organisations at the forefront of addressing matters of injustice, and in this case at Amnesty, human rights issues. I've seen from your career, this is the first time we've met, but I've seen from all of your work, you've really dedicated your life and career to a whole bunch of issues which our students at the School of Social Justice really care about. But I'm curious to know how you practically respond to these really sometimes difficult problems which people around the world face. But first off, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to this conversation. I mean, first off, it would be great to know a bit about what you're doing now at Amnesty International and what it means to be the CEO.
Thank you. Well, it's great to join everyone from the School of Social Justice. Thank you very much for having me. So I'm the Chief Executive of Amnesty International UK, and that's the UK country office of the Amnesty International global family. So we're a global organisation, actually originally founded in the UK about 70 years ago, but now the UK operation is one of many countries where we have operations. And in a nutshell, it means leading a team. It means having a brilliant team around you and focusing our work in the areas where we think we can have the greatest impact, trying to create the culture, trying to create the environment, trying to create some of the chances for success that we want to have, as well as being the organisation's lead spokesperson in a number of different areas on all of the work that we're doing. It's quite a privilege, to be honest.
And lots of responsibility. I mean, as you say, leading a team, that's a big part of leadership, and I look forward to hearing about how you do that very practically in a bit when you talk about methods and tactics. I mean, first off though, like, what does social justice mean to you as somebody leading this organisation?
It's a good question what social justice means. I mean, it has a number of different meanings. So I'll answer a little bit about what I think it means most broadly, but then perhaps go on to just talk about my particular interest and focus within it, if that's okay. So most broadly, I think social justice means the delivery of the world in which I think any person deserves to live. In its broader sense, I think that social justice is about delivering the world that individuals of different backgrounds, different locations, different elements of life success that they may have been born into actually deserve to live within, and deserve in some ways for that background, whether that background is success, or you might argue that background is baggage, which could in other ways hold them back, for that not to determine the outcome for them as people. I think social justice is about creating a world in which that's not what defines the journey that people will go on, and not what defines the destination that they will take. And the reason I say that as my kind of entry point into it is I think it shows you just how wide an area social justice is. So I think in terms of those then people who care about social justice, there are lots of different angles, different ways in which you can work on that, different types of work, and to be honest, they're needed. All of them are needed. My particular sort of take and angle within it is that I believe that social justice is strongly enabled and driven and certainly underpinned by a number of critical legal frameworks, some of which exist now and are, my task is in part about helping to protect, others of which don't exist but I think could significantly help social justice. So that's perhaps my particular angle into the work and where I feel I can have an impact, but there's lots of other broader ways I think of people working on social justice issues as well.
I mean, you're the first guest that we've interviewed who have talked about these legal frameworks, not only the ones that exist and protecting those rights, particularly in this case human rights, but also creating new ones. Can you talk a bit more about that in terms of what you're up to now in Amnesty?
I certainly can talk about what we're up to now at Amnesty. If it's okay, I might just also go back a little bit in history as well.
Of course.
And I'll start with a little bit of my personal history on this area. So I started working in social justice campaigning at about the year 2000 or so. And I worked here in the UK, and I worked primarily on LGB issues as defined at the time. And at that time in the UK, there were some very, very clear distinctions in the law in terms of rights, and actually also in terms even of different elements of criminal law that applied to people, whether or not you were gay or not. And even more specifically within that, whether or not you were a gay man or not, or practicing gay man. Literally, there were different forms of criminal law governing sex. There were restrictions on who could or couldn't choose to adopt children. There were restrictions on what could or couldn't be taught in the classroom about homosexuality. Gay marriage certainly didn't exist. The legal frameworks were distinctly different. So I think I, at that time, through personal experience, through personal passion, had a real window into how those kind of legal underpinnings can very much determine someone's rights, can very much determine justice or otherwise. And if I go back through Amnesty's history and even longer, it's just after the Second World War that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created. And that declaration, that legal framework, was a reaction to what the experiences that had happened during the Second World War and the weaknesses, or you could argue absence, in legal underpinnings relating to human rights. And Amnesty's whole existence, Amnesty's whole work is about the enforcement of those rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which countries around the world have stated that they will adhere to and have signed up to. And there are a number of conventions that flow from that in different areas. We are about the enforcement of those rights. Some countries, some areas are good at that enforcement, some less so. The reason I think it matters so much is even where there are rights abuses, this gives a lever, a power with which to talk about why those rights abuses are wrong. It's not just an argument about me saying, I don't like things, you should do them differently. I can point to an anchor in international law that stands behind those rights, and that's a much, much more powerful vehicle to do that than just my opinion.
Both two great examples of why it is important not only to fight for something but also protect it. And I'd love to go into those two examples in a bit. What I'd love to know before we go into that is just, you kind of alluded to it, like why you have, in particularly for the last 23 years, as you mentioned, been so involved in this work. I mean, there's particularly for people who might just be starting their journey, who might have been angered by something they've seen, they might have experienced something personally themselves and want to do something about it. I mean, what was your spark into doing the work you've committed yourself to? And also, just more generally, why do you stay involved?
So I've got a bit of a philosophy about a good workplace, and I think a good workplace is built around delivering for the people who work there, the people within it, on three pillars. And these pillars are in no particular order, but they are, in my mind, craft, cause and community. And I'll explain what that means. I'll explain what that means. Craft, cause and community. So the craft is that any one of us may have an individual skill or area of delivery that we're passionate about. So given that I'm here having this conversation with you, I suspect that you personally are quite passionate about communications, about filmmaking,
Yes.
about film as a medium of communicating ideas.
Absolutely love it, yeah.
You absolutely love it. Now, I can sense that you're also passionate about a cause, in this case social justice, that otherwise you wouldn't have picked this subject matter for your film. There are other people though who might love the craft of filmmaking and might like all sorts of different subjects to apply it to.
Yeah.
In my case, my craft started primarily as working on policy and legal matters. It's probably truthfully evolved more into leadership of an organisation over the years. But the cause that I was particularly passionate about was rights.
Yeah.
And I think that did come from personal experience in two areas.
Okay.
One, I mentioned my own personal experience as a gay man and seeing the law literally have a different standing for gay people versus non-gay people back at the beginning of this century here in the UK.
And
But
which is, for me, I didn't even know that, just in terms of it only being 23 years ago.
it's very, very recent, very recent.
Yeah.
But I also had a passion about the importance of law and rights that comes from family background. So my family background is a refugee family, not in my generation, but in the generation before mine. And I learned from family history how much of rights and opportunity is dictated by positions in the law and positions that are protected or not for people in a refugee situation. So that kind of gave me a passion on the cause.
Yeah.
But to get, that triptych I talked about, craft, cause, community, I would advise anyone who's thinking about anything to do with their work to remember all three. So the first two, absolutely, craft, you may have a passion for different things. It may be that you're extraordinarily creative and you can get a message out there. It may be that you're a brilliantly systematic mind and actually policy work is perfect for you. It may actually be that your craft is accounting, in which case actually campaigning organisations need to be able to run as an organisation and have sound finances too. All sorts of different crafts are needed in a social justice campaigning organisation. Cause, though, I would say clearly you want to be doing that, whatever that craft is, in service of something you're passionate about.
Okay.
And then community, I would say, is never underestimate actually enjoying the work environment that you are in and being in a work environment that delivers the kind of culture, the kind of peer-to-peer relationships in the working environment that you value. So again, people have different tastes and different takes on that. Some people love a very, very social, very small, very focused, kind of passionate, almost little mission organisation. Others perhaps prefer a much larger organisation which may be more corporate in feel. There's no right or wrong in that. It's very much to do with personal preference, but I would say it's always something worth thinking about. For me, even though Amnesty is a large organisation globally, Amnesty UK, we're only actually just under 200 people, so we're relatively small. And for me personally, that creates the kind of community environment that I like and I enjoy leading. So I thought about all three when it came to applying myself.
I love the framework which you've kind of outlined, because for anyone watching, they can apply it to their own lives. And of course, given that the 3 C's as well, it's easy to remember.
It's easy
craft,
to remember, yeah.
Craft, community, and
cause. That's right. Craft, cause, community. There's no order, by the way. Just think about all three as you think about your choice.
For sure. And so if people then decide to get involved in, say, for example, human rights, what are examples of the ways you or Amnesty International UK right now have actually addressed a human rights issue or problem and achieved some sort of change at the end? I think for people watching, a lot of them are wondering, is change possible? But not only that, how do you practically make it happen? I'm curious to know if you've got an example.
So change is possible, and the type of change that Amnesty International can work on can very much go on a spectrum from times when we are supporting an individual case. Literally, there is a person who may have been imprisoned in any country around the world, and they haven't been imprisoned. They've been imprisoned without due process, and they've been imprisoned on grounds that are not legitimate. And so, in those cases, and we have, you know, many of them over the 70 years that Amnesty's existed. We have, it's been the work of Amnesty and other campaigners, obviously the families of people involved too very often, that has ensured that authorities can't act against those people with impunity. And we have even seen, you know, over the decades, in many cases, those people released and say that they believe it was only the campaigning work that released them. So it can be a very individual situation, and change can happen.
Do you have an example of that? Like kind of a person that maybe, I mean, there's so many cases at Amnesty. The first time I was here was 2006, working on a campaign for human rights in the Philippines, and there were so many stories of journalists, teachers, people who were the victims of extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances. For people who kind of would love to know more about a particular case, do you have an example to share?
Well, so there are actually quite a lot of cases, and people can see some of them detailed on our website. I'll perhaps illustrate a few of the types. I think that will give people a real sense. So, and there are many more types than this, but these are just some of the patterns. So, for example, in a number of places in the world, Amnesty has worked on particular cases where trade unionists have been imprisoned for trying to enforce or improve labour laws in countries. It's actually why the Amnesty movement gets very strong support from the trades union movement. We're really grateful for. Clearly, there are examples. I mean, just to use a kind of British example from most recently, Anousheh Ashouri, who was a British citizen who was in Iran visiting family a few years back, and was just one day arrested on the street. And I think very much was a victim of a kind of broader geopolitical argument happening above him, but he was an individual being absolutely unjustly and incorrectly imprisoned for many years until thankfully last summer, early last summer, he was released in Iran. Other cases most recently that we're seeing a large pattern of people being imprisoned for acting with their right to protest. The subject matters of the protest can vary. Obviously, in some cases, those are protests around issues of democracy. So people saying they feel that they're denied their votes, or the communities that they're from are denied their votes. Clearly, over the last year, we've seen a number of people protesting wars that are happening in different places, and again being arrested for doing so. Increasingly, we're seeing a pattern of people who are passionate and protesting the impacts of climate change. But in a number of places around the world, there are governments and other authorities, sometimes corporate authorities, that don't like people to be articulating what climate change is actually meaning, and climate change disproportionately impacts people from less privileged backgrounds and communities. So those are just a few examples. But the work where change can happen at those levels, but it can also happen at a much more systemic level as well. And I acknowledge that systemic change is harder and longer, but we have seen that campaigning work has genuinely, over the decades, and it sometimes can take decades, but genuinely embedded into law, into international law, into international standards, international conventions, but also into domestic law in a number of different countries, protections that otherwise did not exist. So systemic change can happen. I absolutely agree that systemic change is often longer, and I think if you're working on social justice campaigns, one piece of advice I'd give people is do realise you're very often in for the long haul, and you also have to realise that quite often what you're doing is stopping things getting worse. And that can feel like a hard thing to be campaigning on, because, you know, it's in some ways, even if you're campaigning for a long time, but then you win a big achievement, you feel like, you know, that those years have led to that big achievement. Actually, though, when you're working social justice work, sometimes what you're trying to do is to stop a particular situation from getting worse. And you have to recognise that that's a major achievement in and of itself, even though it's almost like dealing with the counterfactual sometimes.
In a way, it's as important to be defensive as it is to be offensive in terms of fighting for rights.
Depending on what's being thrown at you, yes. I mean, I think sometimes the best form of defence is offence, and by that I mean never forget the importance of having your proactive vision and your proactive goal. I think social justice campaigners who face a lot, increasingly at the moment, you know, we are in a time when by and large, a lot of social justice is not sort of feeling a lot of progressive forces behind it, and perhaps is feeling a lot of regressive power behind it. You know, a lot of arguments being made by authoritarian governments saying that liberal democracy doesn't work as well as authoritarian governments. I disagree with that strongly, by the way, but there's a lot of power they're trying to put behind that argument. A lot of power perhaps being put behind the argument that oligopolies and corporate power and other things are kind of pushing. So we do live in a time when I'd say there's quite a lot of regressive pressure. But my advice to all social justice campaigners, and we very much try to apply it to ourselves within Amnesty, is even when you're fighting someone pressing against you to try and make things worse, it's absolutely critically important, not just for yourself, but actually for the success of your argument, to be really clear about the positive vision that you have. You generally can't win on the territory that someone else is throwing at you, and solely by trying to defend it.
Yeah.
You have to actually remember that you are going to be much more effective at dealing with someone who's trying to make something worse by keeping everyone's mind focused on the positive world that exists if something's better.
I will be asking a question which kind of touches actually a part of the negative sides of campaigning. But before that, let's go to the positive, because as you point out, hope, positivity, a vision for progress is always necessary for us to just kind of maintain ourselves within this world of social justice campaigning. What is the vision of Amnesty International UK for the next sort of decade, and what's driving you and your team to do the work you do day in, day out?
It's a great question in relation to what our vision is for the next decade, and we actually developed just before 2022 an 8-year strategy, so one covering right to the end of the decade. And actually, before I describe 3 core pillars within that, I'll just say one thing, which is I've mentioned how you have to be in it for the long haul in social justice campaigning, and I think sometimes organisations in social justice make the error of thinking we should have a 3-year strategy, and actually you can barely achieve some of the things that you need to in that period. So
started sometimes.
Barely started. So we recognise that, and we said, no, actually, let's have a vision to 2030. There's sort of 3 pillars within that, and they interrelate, right? They do genuinely interrelate. So one is about genuinely winning systemic and individual human rights victories. And those systemic sides, for example, can include the enhancement of the human rights frameworks that underpin human rights, or protecting some of the new areas where we're seeing challenges to human rights.
What does that mean for people who don't know what a human rights framework is?
A human rights framework, sorry, apologies, I should say, avoid the jargon. A human rights framework is essentially the legal underpinnings of human rights. So in the UK, for example, the Human Rights Act, which codified into UK law a number of elements of international human rights standards that the UK had previously said for a long time that we would adhere to, but you couldn't actually enforce within domestic law. That's an example of a human rights framework here in the UK. But there are international human rights frameworks as well that go right the way flowing up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which many countries around the world have signed up their adherence to. And then a number of different conventions in different areas like labour, economic and social rights, gender rights, again, which form a legal framework. So we call them human rights frameworks, but what they essentially are the law that mean that human rights is not just a matter of opinion. Human rights is not just a matter of saying what would be nice, or it's not even just a matter of philosophy, where you say, well, look at this philosophy, I support it or I don't support it. Obviously, there has been a lot of philosophy on human rights over hundreds of years that led to these legal frameworks, but it's now a matter of fact and international commitment and law that these standards need to be
Which
applied.
are enforceable, and therefore people
Exactly.
can be supportive.
So those frameworks. So back to the question about Amnesty International UK's aims. One pillar around winning those victories, individual and systemic, relating to the frameworks. The other actually about a genuine, significant increase and deepening in understanding and passion for human rights in the country. And I think we have to acknowledge in this case, as campaigners, that perhaps over the last decade, Amnesty hasn't done as well on this as we should have done. There was probably a bit of a high watermark in the UK about 15, 20 years or so ago of public positive consciousness towards human rights. And I'd say since that time, the label human rights has been misused by a number of opponents of human rights, and we kind of let that happen in the public consciousness, or at least we haven't successfully managed to not let it happen. So we have to change that. And then the third pillar that we have is not just a kind of general positive awareness, but a powerful, passionate movement for human rights. So in some ways, we obviously have the ingredients for this in Amnesty already. Amnesty UK has about 200,000 members and supporters around the UK. So there obviously is already a passionate movement even within the Amnesty family. But there are many, many more individuals and community groups who are passionate about human rights and who Amnesty should be supporting to articulate on human rights in their individual areas as well.
I mean, there's clearly so many means through which people can get involved with Amnesty International to achieve those three aims. I mean, what do you say to those people who want to get involved, and how do they get involved? Because I think in your case, you're someone who leads an organisation where people can actually practically literally come to this building, get involved, volunteer, write letters. There's a whole bunch of different tactics and practical means people can contribute as part of this 200,000 strong movement. What do you say to people who want to step into Amnesty International's doors and make a difference?
So obviously the prime way that people get involved with Amnesty International directly is more online than walking in the doors of the building. You don't have to come to our building in London to participate, in fact far from it. So if you want to be an Amnesty supporter and want to be involved in campaigning, there are a huge number of digital actions that we involve people all around the country in. And we also have local groups in the Amnesty family around the country as well. So literally you can be physically involved in things and not have to come here to the HQ. But more broadly than just that, I would say there are a lot of people who are involved in different community groups that have nothing to do with Amnesty, but actually it's about thinking about why human rights and rights matter to the people in those groups. And sometimes, just to give you an example, we've got people who are passionate about human rights. Give you an example, passionate about housing rights. Many people don't realise here in the UK that housing and public policy commitments to housing are not just a sort of economic nicety or the government being just choosing to make this. In 1976, the UK signed up to international conventions relating to the right to housing. It's just not something, to be honest, that I think governments, particularly government in England and Wales, has actually necessarily always delivered on. But the reason I use that as an example is I know that there are lots of people involved in community groups around the country, all sorts of different communities, who help to educate people in those communities about their rights and help them to enforce them whether it's public authorities or in some cases private landlords or others are not properly delivering on those rights. That person is a human rights defender. That person is a human rights advocate. They might not have time to formally become part of Amnesty International, but that's fine. They don't have to be to be a human rights defender and a human rights activist in the UK. So absolutely, if there's someone who's watching this and is passionate about campaigning on human rights, absolutely get involved in Amnesty International. Of course you can, but don't underestimate that actually something that can be equally powerful, if not in some cases more powerful, is if you're already involved in local community work, local campaigning of different types, actually helping people to understand what their rights are, or understand the application of what you're working on as a rights application, not just a nice idea, can be even more powerful way of enforcing human rights in the country.
I think that kind of push and kind of nudge for people to get involved no matter where they are or what they're doing, I think is really important, particularly given just that Amnesty International is so open to working in collaboration with organisations, and having that sort of diversity of initiatives within the social justice space is so crucial, backed by larger organisations like Amnesty. I mean, to talk about some of the risks of being a campaigner, this can be a dangerous job if you're fighting against very powerful people and organisations, particularly in countries and jurisdictions where they might not have been afforded the kinds of protections we might get in certain countries, places like London where we're at now. What do you say to folk who may be afraid of getting involved, which is a very natural sense to have in a way,
Yes.
given what's happened to many people who have fought for change? Do you have any thoughts on that to share with people?
Absolutely, you're right to say that working in social justice campaigning or in human rights campaigning in the area that I particularly focus on is not an easy or always safe pursuit. So the first piece of advice I would say is there's no shame in being afraid. And there's no shame at all, in fact I'd say the opposite, in thinking about your own safety and the safety of your family around you. The first principle, I think, of any social justice campaigner should always be to think about doing no harm in your own work, and actually to recognise that you may not be able to campaign in the way that you might be lucky enough to here in the UK or maybe in other parts of the world, but in some other parts you can't. To realise that you aren't necessarily lucky enough to be able to do that, and that there may be more restricted ways that you can still try and have an impact, but protect your safety and the safety of people that you love around you, is a completely correct thing to do and a completely legitimate thing to do. I mean, having said that, the world is still full of brave people who put themselves, into extraordinary places for their work in all sorts of social justice campaigning, obviously not just human rights, including people who've been part of the Amnesty International family or worked for Amnesty International, who in some cases have come under personal threat, sometimes arrest, sometimes not able to live in the country of their origin. And that happens even when they're part of something as big and strong and famous as Amnesty. So the human rights defenders around the world, or human rights activists around the world, frequently, for the passion of their work, will find themselves at personal risk. I think that there are a number of, at the end of the day, it comes down to individual choice, the extent to which you feel that you still want to speak openly about the issues, whatever they are, the social justice issues that matter to you, regardless of what the impact of that might be. If you go back here in the UK just over 100 years ago, you could have made exactly the same discussion about people campaigning on women's suffrage, who spoke up and were arrested calling for the right to vote. As you might today for people who, as I say, are arrested or under threat. I know that there are people, I was talking to some actually just earlier today, I won't say exactly where, but in another part of the world, who are organising a gay pride protest, and are almost certainly, when that protest takes place, going to be targeted by both the police and, to be honest, just organised thugs. That country's police force lets attack pride protests. It's still something that, even knowing that, they want to do because of the importance of it to them. So yes, there are lots and lots of brave people who take conscious decisions that put themselves at different forms of risk. But the advice that I would give to any social justice campaigner is to recognise that actually protecting your own safety and working out a way in which you can perhaps best still have a campaigning impact while protecting your own safety can not only just be absolutely the right and fair thing for any individual to do, but can also be a way where you can have a longer term impact than perhaps some of the other ones. So it is different in different situations. Different people will make different choices about it, but there is certainly there's nothing wrong in thinking about how to most safely campaign. And I certainly say this, very, very important for people to realise, if you're organising campaigning activity that you're encouraging others to be part of, remember that you have a duty as the person organising it to think of the safeguarding of those other people. So again, that's about, if they're adults and they're not vulnerable adults, it's about ensuring that they're making an informed choice to participate in whatever it is you're organising with whatever impact that may have. But also, if you are organising campaigning and perhaps there are people who have particular vulnerabilities, including children, who might not be as able to make their own informed choice, then remember that you have a duty to consider their safety as you're organising activities. Even if you might be willing to take certain risks yourself, you shouldn't be taking those risks on behalf of other people. Sorry, you shouldn't be forcing other people to take those risks on their own behalf unless they're able to be informed in that and that you've been really clear about that.
Thank you for sharing that. I think it's a really important reminder of the responsibility that we all have in trying to build movements, being aware of our legal duties as well as our responsibilities to our fellow campaigners and activists, particularly when we bring them with ourselves. But also, I mean, look, like, our mission is to train the next generation of Martin Luther Kings, and MLK was a role model and inspiration for me, but also his life ended fighting for civil rights. And there are many folk who are fighting for things because actually life right now in the world in which they might live, without those rights, without those freedoms, you know, sometimes death is one of the only things that sadly has shown for people to take notice on these issues, where we're seeing with the revolutions and all the problems in recently in the Middle East, like sometimes people don't take notice until people's lives are actually under threat. And I think that's why the work of Amnesty International is so important for protecting those people. And actually, like, now turning a bit to yourself, so we've got around 10 minutes left. You are a leader of as you mentioned, a well-known organisation that supports so many people. But also you've done that at War Child, at UNICEF UK. You have led organisations both on the business end of running an organisation as well as the people end. I mean, what does it take? What are the skills that are necessary to be a leader of an organisation for people who want to follow in Sacha's footsteps and be a CEO in the future? So
I'd say there are two big areas of approach or qualities that I would say be important if someone's excited about and interested in running an organisation. And I should say, by the way, that there are many brilliant jobs that can have massive impact that don't involve being the chief executive of an organisation. So back to my thought about craft, cause and community, if the craft of being a leader of an organisation isn't as exciting to you as working on a particular element of delivery, don't make yourself try and enjoy organisational leadership just for the sake of it. You know, actually focus on what you're passionate about. But if you're thinking perhaps leadership is the thing for me, I would say there's two sides. One is, I think you have to genuinely be excited by and enjoy what I call whole systems thinking. And by that, what I mean is looking at an entire organisation or an entire operation and being able to see how the different parts of what it deliver fit together and what you need to do and how they interrelate to most effectively move forward as a whole. If you're the kind of person who only looks at things in silo, you won't be a good organisational leader, because actually organisations don't operate as a series of silos, and you have to be someone who can really see and understand, and indeed help others to understand, how those interrelated pieces best operate together, and indeed if you want to take leaps forward in particular directions, which pieces of that need to move in particular ways together. If you're passionate about that whole systems thinking, you've got a quality of leadership. The other side, I would say, is you absolutely have to love people. It's amazing how many people go into leadership but don't really like people, and then I'll be honest, they don't succeed. If you don't believe that people, by and large, get up every morning aiming to do their best in the world, if you don't believe that people perform at their best when they're happiest, rather than perform at their best in a culture of fear, if you don't believe that actually your role is about helping people to be brave rather than making them afraid of being blamed, those are the qualities of someone who likes people. But quite often people go into leadership and they don't really like people that much. They're not very social themselves. I don't mean that's about having parties, I mean being interested in people. They're not passionate about people much themselves, and then perhaps unsurprisingly, if they're not passionate about people, they create cultures with all of the negative qualities. Whereas if you are passionate about people, what I think you do is you realise that happy people, even when working on very serious issues, see, happiness isn't about being silly. I mean, you can be silly and be happy, but you can work on very serious issues and be happy in your working environment. And I would actually argue that's really important when you work on really serious issues. It's necessary. So I think if you're the kind of person who you feel has both of those qualities, the whole systems thinking one is in a way very much about kind of almost how a business mind works, but you're also someone who loves people and likes people to be feeling rewarded as they're around you. You've got the core qualities. If those are perhaps less your thing, then that's, just remember, that's not necessarily wrong, it's just different, and maybe the craft of leadership isn't the craft for you, but another area of delivery would be.
I mean, a very practical means at which you look at leading an organisation. I feel, just on the second bit, I mean, one of the questions I have is just how do you transform a culture, particularly when there's you might be entering an organisation which has a particular culture, and you believe the future lies in a different pathway. How does one, I'm a football fan, and Jurgen Klopp coming to Liverpool Football Club and completely transforming things and saying, give me a few seasons to really put my plan together and lead this organisation and put the right ingredients together. I mean, how do you turn around an organisation when you come in as a leader?
It's a good question. It's one that I've had to do in a few places, and I think there are probably a few core elements to it. First, I would say you have to have a real vision in your own mind about the positive culture you would like to see. It sounds basic, because in a way, how could you possibly help create something if you don't actually have clear in your own mind the core qualities and what that would feel like and how it would manifest itself? But you'll be amazed by how many people talk about transformational culture and changing something, and then when you say, so forget about changing something for a minute, just imagine you were creating it today, what would it be like? And they go, oh, they're so focused on the sort of almost the question of changing that they're not quite sure what they're trying to change to. So you have to be very clear on that yourself.
But the feeling bit, just because it makes it so much more real, it's like, well, if tomorrow it would be different, what would it feel like?
Yeah, but the second thing I'd then say is that you can pretty quickly identify certain pillars, particularly if you've got a lot of experience in organisational change, that will be the ones that either most accelerate and embed the organisation culture that you are helping to create, new organisation culture you're going to create, and or are perhaps the pillars that most reinforce the one that you're trying to leave and you need to change. And they can be all sorts of different things. And this is where it really does vary from organisation to organisation, but if you've worked on them, you can sort of recognise them from a kind of menu typically. But see, some places, for example, there are places that I've come into where there was quite a culture of people having lots of disputes internally. So you might think, that's entirely about behaviours, or that's entirely about how people are feeling. Don't get me wrong, those contributed, definitely. But one of the reasons why there were lots of disputes I identified in a few places was actually that there wasn't a very organised business plan. The organisation wasn't very clear on its priorities. It had a group of passionate people who, whenever they came to any choice, felt that all they could do was to fight with each other over the right choice because they didn't have any anchors that they could latch onto. So it was as much about the organisation being disorganised as it was about whether or not you then also said, even when we're organised, we will still have some things where we might think that choice A is better than choice B. How do we conduct ourselves in that discussion? Again, even getting into that, just using it as an example, you might think, so that's all about then how you act then. It is, but it's also actually about saying, what are the kind of frameworks of evidence and choice making that we'll use? So again, it's identifying that people were perhaps struggling with knowing how to have a discussion with each other in a way that they could both recognise and respect, so they would fall to conflict. So sometimes you have to really, so if you've identified, for example, in that case, one of the pillars of the culture that needed to be changed was a culture where people were resorting to conflict as a means of decision making. So a vision, obviously, that people are happy that there is less conflict. Actually, you realise that you needed to build a number of different elements in. It wasn't just a case of saying, hey everyone, don't fight, or when you disagree about something, act in a particular way. You had to get to the root cause.
How did you get to that root cause? What's your analysis process, and how do you start in a way of how do you start identifying the problem?
Well, I would just say it's very, very, very rare for anyone in leadership to come across a problem in a culture that someone else hasn't come across before.
Yeah.
So there is an awful lot of stuff that's been written and studied about this. Okay. Sometimes it can be a little bit waffly and theoretical, but some authors are better than others at showing it tangibly. But you are very, very, very rarely coming across something the first time. Obviously, if you've been a leader yourself for a number of years, quite often you come across things you've literally seen yourself in other organisations, really so that adds. Yeah. But even when it's your first time in leadership, I would say actually it's not the first time a leader has experienced what you've experienced. And that's my final kind of tip on this point, I think I would say, is that quite often you come into organisations and what people will say is, the reason we have this issue, this challenge, or whatever it is very particular to us. This is a thing of this organisation. Quite often, particularly when you're new in an organisation, you say, actually, it isn't really. We're just manifesting it in a particular way. And as a result, some of the key ingredients for creating the culture that we want, we're not the first people in the world to try and do that. What we need to do is apply them in particular ways here.
What I like about that is the fact that then it becomes manageable. You identify it, you see how others have responded to it, and you don't think of yourself as unique, and actually just say, look, this is a human problem which throughout history others have faced. I mean, I'm just very aware of time, Sacha, and we've got just a couple minutes left. And there's one last question which I'd really love to kind of ask you before we end. You have been a leader in many organisations, and one of the questions is how you became a leader. What are your learning? How do you learn? What are your processes? What is your philosophy to developing yourself? Particularly for people who just want a way they can develop themselves to reach that kind of level.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. I'd say that typically leaders, particularly in social justice organisations, leadership is undervalued as a quality. And so actually one of the issues for a lot of social justice organisations is that you take people who are particularly good at delivering in an area and you suddenly make them the leader of a team or the leader of the organisation, and you don't give them any particular training or support in leadership. And it's under-recognised that leadership has a number of qualities and skills in and of itself. I was fortunate enough in my career to also have time when I was in the private sector, and sometimes that, to be honest, is better at recognising the training and development you need in leadership. And I've been able to bring some of that into the not-for-profit sector. My final thought, though, I would say to people is as well as the hard skills around leadership, the biggest single factor for whether or not you will be successful is whether or not you're enjoying it. And whether or not you feel that you are supported and you're in an environment where when you're supporting other people, and obviously leadership can feel very much like a pyramid that you're the top of and it's all about what you give down. But great leadership, you also feel really supported from the whole environment around you, including those who are on a hierarchy are below you. So it is actually very, very, very possible, in fact I'd say necessary, if you're going to be a good leader, to be enjoying it and create an environment, or help create an environment in which you will enjoy practicing that leadership as well. It's also very doable, and I think that can lead to the most highly effective leadership. And then clearly the case that I feel that's very valuably applied, that very highly effective leadership having the highest possible impact on social justice campaigning work.
Sacha, thank you so much for your time. I wish we had more, because we can go on, and particularly I felt like you came alight but when thinking about how we shift cultures and move forward, because when you're working with organisations, it is almost an organism which needs to be healthy in order for it to do its best work. And I think just the way you described it is a way we haven't heard yet at the School of Social Justice, so a very helpful and unique insight. Before we end, do you have any final words for our students at the School of Social Justice that you'd like to leave them with?
So I think I'd say, firstly, thank you for the time in listening to my thoughts. I hope that they've given you some stimulus and food for thought. I think it's absolutely fantastic that there are so many people in the world who are passionate about social justice and passionate about campaigning today and going into campaigning. So my first tip to people will be, remember, you're not alone. Actually, even though it can sometimes feel lonely, there are an awful lot of people who are campaigning alongside you, and you can have a massive support network alongside you as well. And my second tip, I said it a minute ago in relation to leadership, would be to recognise that you can and should, I think, aim to enjoy your campaigning work even when it's on issues that are tough, because you should keep in your mind, even when it can take a long time, that you're having a massive impact and that's making a great contribution in the world, and feel rewarded on an emotional level for doing so.
Wonderful message, and thank you for your time. I'm sure after watching this, so many of our students will not only want to really push ahead and become social justice change makers, but also consider contributing to Amnesty and maybe even applying for a job here and starting a career.
Well,
here, so.
Absolutely, it's a great place to work. So jobs here are all advertised on the website, but as I said, you can be involved in the Amnesty movement, doing campaigning work in your local community as well, and that's even more valuable in lots of ways. So yes, I hope lots of people from this will be involved in human rights campaigning in all its forms.
Thank you for being an advocate for this, and we will be supporting you from afar.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
This educational content is absolutely free. Why? Because our vision is a world where anybody, no matter their background, can learn how to make a difference. To keep going, we need your help. Can you become our next patron? Can you help us reach 2,500 patrons? I really hope so. Whatever the case, hope you learned something today, and sending you peace and love. Let's keep learning.